Hello and welcome to episode 73B of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basel, and this is, I gotta make sure here. Okay, it's recording. This is called 73B because I did this entire Q&A yesterday, which lasted about 2 hours, and at the end of it, I realized that for some reason, it didn't record. And I think it's because I've got like two different kinds of software running at the same time that get in each other's way. One is like sound quality for the mic, and the other one is the video stuff. And it's just not good. This is the second time this has happened. But anyways, on with the show, because I think it's recording. I'll look again. Yep, it's recording. So, some of you may have noticed that this is the holiday season. In fact, we are in the midst of Saturnalia, and tomorrow, at the time of recording this, is the feast day of Sol Invictus. So I'm studiously avoiding any Christmassy backgrounds and filming this in my bedroom. Our bedroom, I should say. Not mine and yours, of course, silly, but mine and my sweetheart's. So I guess I should just wade into this and start answering questions again. And the first question is from Raja Kumara. And Raja Kumara says, are Theravada monks allowed to watch movies when they travel in the plane? If they do, does it break any precept? Well, there is a rule against a monk making effort to listen to music or making effort to watch entertainment shows. So, back in the old days, when I would ride a plane and they had the screens like mounted up high, you could just sit there and watch the movie because you weren't making any special effort. You're going to be riding that plane anyway. But then later, they started requiring earphones to listen to the movie just in case somebody else didn't want to listen to the movie. And then that would be making a special effort. And so I would watch the movie as a silent movie without subtitles or anything. And sometimes the nice flight attendant, bless her heart, would come up and explain to me that if I put on the earphones, I could hear the movie, but it would be, at least back in my strict monk days, it would have been the violation of a dukkha offense, the commission of a dukkha offense. So I didn't do it. And then after that, then finally, just every seat back has like a movie screen, and you can pick which movie you want to watch. And so when it got to that point, I pretty much just started becoming a lax monk and occasionally watched a movie while during one of my many trips back and forth across the Pacific Ocean. So that was kind of like the beginning of the end for me, I guess, was when I started watching movies on airplanes, thereby committing a minor ecclesiastical offense. Watching and listening. I mean, back in my strict days, I used to make a special request. Like if I was going to ride a bus from southern Burma to upper Burma, which is like a night-long offense, or yeah, well, it practically is an offense. It's just like a night-long ordeal. So I would specifically request, I want to ride a bus that doesn't have movies. And Burmese movies pretty much suck anyway. And so I'd wind up on this bus that was like part like cargo transfer. I'd be like sitting on a bag of rice with somebody's foot in my ear, and there'd be like a kid 2 seats back just puking his guts out for the past hour, and my bare foot's in some kind of liquid, and I'm so crammed in there that I can't even bend forward enough to see what my foot is in. I'm hoping that it's just like transmission fluid or something and not the puke from the kid 2 seats back. So I did that for a while, and then finally I kind of gave up on that and just rode the regular buses. And then, of course, you watch crappy Burmese movies. And the monks get to sit up front on the bus too, so I'd be right up there with the TV screen. But I digress. I'm digressing wildly. So getting back to the question here, Theravada monks are allowed to watch movies so long as they're not making a special effort, or if the movie is like a spiritually oriented movie, like maybe some kind of educational documentary with some kind of dharma involved, then it'd probably be okay. But making a special effort to listen to music or to watch entertainment shows is against the rules for a monk. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Kzen. And Kzen always reminds me of Kazin, which is a kind of alien race in Larry Niven stories. But I assume Kzen is human, partly just because he spells his name differently. And he says, I assume it's a he, have you heard the story that Steve Jobs named Apple after Neem Karoli Baba's favorite fruit? Interesting if true beings that Apple is the most ubiquitous company on earth, carrying on a certain essence of Baba. No, I'd never heard that story until Kzen here divulged it to me. I did watch the movie about Steve Jobs, in which apparently the name Apple just was like off the top of somebody's head while they were driving in a car. It's just, hey, let's just call it Apple. So it is true, though. I mean, movies aren't necessarily accurate. And so, yeah, it may be that Steve Jobs was a fan of Neem Karoli Baba, if not a votary, and named it after Neem Karoli Baba's favorite fruit, because there were a lot of apples passing back and forth around Neem Karoli Baba, if you can believe what Ram Dass says about him. Although Neem Karoli Baba did like other kinds of fruit too. He did eat pomegranates occasionally, for example. But yeah, I'd never heard the story, and so I'm just going to move on to the next question, because we got quite a lot of questions, which is pretty much as usual lately. And I should point out now that from now on it's going to be 3 questions each, and pray that I do not reduce the number further. So this next question is from Toronto Nat. And Toronto Nat says, what's the significance of Christmas in the Alt-Buddhist worldview? How should Western Buddhists go about observing Christmas celebrations? Well, I assume there's more than one Alt-Buddhist worldview, that different Alt-Buddhists will have different worldviews and thus different interpretations of the significance of Christmas. But for the most part, Christmas is a secular institution. It's just a secular feast day in the West, in the secular West, that it being the birthday of Jesus is really of secondary importance to most Americans, I'm pretty sure. So, I mean, you can celebrate Christmas as a Buddhist. Maybe not so much celebrating the birthday of Jesus, and Christmas Day, in all likelihood, is not the birthday of Jesus, because I have read that the first recorded celebration of Christmas was like in May, and then it got changed to January 6th or 8th, something like that. And I think the Greek Orthodox Christians still celebrate it as January 6th or 8th or something. But then in the western half of the Roman Empire, as the empire in general was converting to Christianity, they decided, well, let's just ease some Christianity into the feast calendar by replacing the feast day of Sol Invictus with Christmas. So December 25th was and still is, I suppose, to a lot of pagans, the feast day of Sol Invictus. And so, but I should say that, to be fair to the Christians, I mean, the standard Buddhist day celebrating the birthday of the Buddha himself, probably that was not his real birthday either. I consider it statistically very unlikely that the Buddha was born, became enlightened, and died all on the full moon of May. So there's no like ancient Pali text saying that the Buddha was born on the full moon of May. So it's just a later traditional thing. You don't know when his birthday is. You want to celebrate his birthday anyway, so you just pick a day. Christians picked the feast day of Sol Invictus, and the Buddhists picked the traditional day on which the Buddha became enlightened. So getting back to the question, because I'm digressing just spasmodically here, I mean, Christmas as a secular institution, fine. It's nice to give gifts. Christmas trees are pretty, no problem there. How should Western Buddhists go about observing Christmas celebrations? Well, you should watch How the Grinch Stole Christmas. It's a good Christmas movie, and there's no mention at all of Jesus getting born. It's just a nice movie about how Christmas is like a matter of attitude. Christmas is a state of mind, that it's not all about getting presents, which of course many children would consider to be vile heresy. But let's assume that we're not small children here. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovax and Sipad Zidina. And Siovax and Sipad Zidina says, I have a theory. Based on my reading of the suttas, it seems as if Nibbana is always used as a verb to mean extinguishment in the early suttas. Nibbana element with remainder is the extinguishment of the three poisons, while the Nibbana element without remainder is the extinguishment of the five aggregates. I talked to someone that speaks Bengali, and he says that's how the word is used in his language even today. And as an aside, I've been told that it's the same in Nepal, in the Nepali language. Anyways, I continue. Like when you turn off the light, they use the word Nibbana. But in the later traditions, the word Nibbana was used for what is referred to as the deathless element, that realm, the unproliferated, thus can't be referred to, etc. But Nibbana was never used for this in the suttas. They are just closely associated, and maybe later tradition confused the specific differences of the two concepts. Do you think this makes sense? Or are there examples that go counter to this hypothesis? Yeah, there actually are quite a few examples that go counter to that. But getting back up towards the top of Siovax and Sipad Zidina's theoretical question here, he says Nibbana was always used as a verb, but actually the verb would be nibayadi, to blow out. Nibbana is like a verbal noun. It's the ana at the end of a Pali word is like ing in English. So it'd be like skiing as a noun. So, his coughing is really bothering me. So coughing there would be a verbal noun, his coughing. So, yeah, I mean, it is kind of a verbal noun. And a lot of the time, Nibbana, as an ethical term, it's referring to, the attaining of enlightenment. But Nibbana as like the deathless state is found in very early texts also. For example, there's that vestigial, just that fragment that's found in the Digha Nikaya and the Majjhima Nikaya referring to infinite consciousness that's luminous all around. It's formless. And I mean, that's a very ancient fragment that has found its way into two different suttas. Also, in the Udana, for example, there are a number of descriptions of Nibbana, where the sun doesn't shine, the moon doesn't glow, the stars don't twinkle, earth, water, wind, and fire gain no foothold. Like, for example, in the inspired utterance at the end of Udana 110, which is the Bahia Sutta. That's also relatively very old Buddhism, very old text. But again, it's referring to Nibbana as a kind of metaphysical state. So Nibbana as a kind of ethical attainment and Nibbana as like the metaphysical state that the attainment attains are both pretty common in going all the way back to the oldest texts we've got. So I guess I answered that question. By golly. So I'll just move on to the next question from Siovax and Sipad Zidina. After I take a sip of bovine glandular secretions. So he says, which side of the argument are you on? Is it alone like a rhinoceros, or is it alone like a rhinoceros's horn? And yeah, I'm in the latter camp. I think it means alone like the horn of a rhinoceros. And there are two reasons for that. One is that the Indian rhinoceros, or so I've been told, is not particularly solitary. And second, the Indian rhinoceros has only one horn, as opposed to African rhinoceroses that have two horns. And most animals that have horns have two horns, or antlers. Cow has two, water buffalo has two, deer have two antlers, Most animals with horns have two, a pair of them. You've got like a mated pair, almost like a boy antler and a girl antler. But the rhinoceros having only one horn, I mean, that's indicative that the rhinoceros's horn does not have a mate. It goes alone. So I assume that the Kagawisana Sutta, Kagawisana literally means sword horn, referring to the horn and to the rhinoceros that is the bearer of this sword horn. I think it's emphasizing the solitary nature of the rhinoceros, which has only one horn, as opposed to most horned animals that have two. So I'll just move on to Siovakshi Sipat Zidana's next question here. What is the significance of the term Tathagata? It seems like originally this was the name used during the Buddha's actual lifetime, even by himself, rather than Buddha. The context of asking for its significance is that of its meaning and how it relates to the broader culture on top of just the Dhamma, because there are suttas where people of other traditions are asked about the condition of a Tathagata after death, alongside other questions like of the universe, or if the universe is infinite and such. But this wouldn't make any sense if there wasn't a general concept of a Tathagata that was shared among all traditions or the culture at large. So this is kind of two questions. One is, what is the significance of the term Tathagata? What does it mean, I guess? And the second is with regard to whether Tathagata was a specifically Buddhist term or whether it was common in the spiritual culture of northern India in the Buddhist time. So what Tathagata means, according to my interpretation, there's a number of different interpretations, but my interpretation, I think my interpretation is correct, otherwise it wouldn't be my interpretation, is that it's the combination of two words, Datta and Agata. Datta means like this or such, and it's referring to essentially the enlightened state. And that was common in early Buddhism. They would use a term like Datta, or Tadi is another one that's found in the Atthakavagga, which just means like this or such, because it's how you put into words something that can't be put into words. So, and then Agata means, it's the past participle of agachati, which means to come, or it can also mean to become. So the Tathagata is he who has become thus. He who has attained the state of suchness. And whether it was common to other like philosophical or spiritual traditions in ancient India, I don't know for sure. I can't remember ever seeing Tathagata in like the Upanishadic literature or the Bhagavad Gita or Jain literature, although the only ancient Indian language that I read in the original is Pali. So, there might be stuff in Sanskrit that gets translated into English, away from, in a way that you wouldn't recognize it as Tathagata, but I'm pretty sure Tathagata is found only in Buddhist texts. So it may be that it's a kind of anachronism or a paraphrase. Somebody comes and asks if an enlightened being still exists after death, and then in the Buddhist text, they just say, does a Tathagata exist after death? When it may be that the person that asked the question used a different word and it just got paraphrased as Tathagata. But somebody out there who has read a lot of Jain literature or Sanskrit literature, if they like non-Buddhist Sanskrit literature, if they've seen the word Tathagata out there, then that's nice. That's fine. They can say it. They can point it out in the comments or something. But I think it may be a uniquely Buddhist term. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Lieberlam, and it's like three questions combined into one. So Lieberlam says, if an alien or supernatural being could reproduce with a human to make a near human, even if we knew they came from otherworldly origins, would they need to be judged by their physical characteristics to disqualify for ordination as monks? Could they hypothetically ordain? And how do you think world religion would change if the heroic God-man like Jesus, Arius, or Odin took on dharmic lives and legacies? So let's see, the first sub-question is if an alien or supernatural being could reproduce with a human to make a near human, even if we knew that they came from otherworldly origins, would they need to be judged by their physical characteristics to disqualify for ordination as monks? Um, I think we can set aside aliens because the ancient Pali texts really don't have much concept of space aliens, um, other than supernatural beings like devas or brahmas. And I don't like in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, you had demigods who were like half god and half human. Like Achilles, for example. But I guess he would still be considered human. Achilles would still be considered human, even though he was born to a goddess. And in ancient India, I don't think they really have a concept of demigods, other than they have a concept of like avatars, like Krishna was an avatar of Vishnu. So, and according to the Hindus, even the Buddha was an avatar of Vishnu, but it would be sort of like the spirit of a god inhabiting briefly, my god standards, the physical body of a human. And so the physical body would be human. Like Krishna was human in addition to being divine, sort of like a lot of Christians say that Jesus was human in addition to being divine. So yeah, it's a tricky question, and I don't know if the texts really make an issue of it. Whether in the Vinaya texts, they deal with the situation of, whether half God, half human would be allowed to be ordained. Just be looking human isn't good enough, because there is a story about a naga, which is like a fire-breathing cobra dragon that can shapeshift and assume human form and has essentially human intelligence. It assumed human form and was ordained as a monk. But then when it fell asleep, it reverted back to its naga form. And then when the monks found out about it, the Buddha told them, you're not really ordained. You're going to have to go, because only humans can be monks. So even though he assumed human form, that wasn't good enough. But exactly where you would draw the line, I guess we're going to have Vinaya scholars hammer this out and come to a decision at the next Buddhist council. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Cool Whip. Oh, wait. No, we're not going to do that, because there was the other. Let's see here. There's the last part of this question by Lieberland that I haven't answered yet. How do you think world religion would change if the heroic God-man like Jesus, Arius, or Odin took on dharmic lives and legacies? Well, that's kind of a strange question, because I'm pretty sure Jesus, at least, did take on a dharmic life and legacy. Not like Sanskrit dharma, but he was like a renunciant, and he lived more or less of a yogic life. Apparently, he attained psychic powers. So, and Arius, if he's referring to the heresiarch Arius, then he was probably a relatively spiritual person too. I really can't say with regard to Odin. I'm not familiar with his mythology, or whether or not there really was a human origin to Odin. That I've been told that Odin may have just been a god and then got accused of just being a glorified human by later Christians. So, yeah, the heroic God-man, he took on dharmic lives and legacies. I don't really fully understand that question, because I'm pretty sure at least Jesus, of the three examples here, did take on a dharmic life and legacy. Although, the followers of Jesus pretty much cast aside all the renunciation stuff, and they just worship Jesus. So, but there are a lot of Buddhists like that too. So I think I answered that question, even though I don't completely understand that third part there. How world religion would change if the heroic God-man took on dharmic lives and legacies. Some of them do, as far as I can tell. So I'll just move on to the next question now, for real this time. This is from Cool Whip. And Cool Whip says, Cool Whip has like little headers over each question. Each question has a title. So the title of the first question is Relationship Between Mind and Matter. And he says, what is the relationship on how a non-physical process, mind, can affect a physical process, external reality. And I'm going to check, make sure this is really recording this time. God, I hope it is. But there was like a little, I mean, it looked like it was recording last time too. So, gosh, if it's not really recording, I'm diddled, essentially. So let's see. What is the relationship on how a non-physical process can affect a physical process? Well, I'm not a materialist. I do not believe that physical matter is ultimately real. In fact, I've said a number of times that the next Copernican revolution in science may be the realization that what a psychologist calls consciousness or mind is a very complicated form of what a physicist calls energy, and that's probably already the case, but it's also vice versa, that what a physicist calls energy is really just an elemental, extremely simple form of what a psychologist would call mind or consciousness. So that would make the entire universe a kind of manifestation of mind. And also, I mean, there's like the philosophy of Spinoza, who was saying that mind and matter are both real in a sense, but they're both ultimately the same. And that's kind of what I would say also. So I really don't see that there really is a problem. My interpretation kind of shoots in the head the mind-body problem, because the body doesn't ultimately exist. I mean, you could argue the mind doesn't either, but at least we have direct access to mind. We do not have direct access to matter. There's no way to prove that physical matter really exists, which Immanuel Kant considered to be the scandal of philosophy. So, yeah, I guess I answered that one. I think I answered it better the first time in the one that you didn't get to see because it didn't record. And I sincerely hope it's recording for real this time. So, Cool Whip's next question has the title, Extrapolation of Karma, a Mind-Matter Reversal. And the question is, the reality of karma one is able to see or infer in the present moment is different from the reality of karma from one life to the next. For example, when you commit an evil action, you can see the karmic imprint on your mind in the present moment, purely mental, and the mental physical effect of that evil action has to wait till the later lifetimes. Karma means action or intention, but beyond the present moment, the extrapolation of karma are like mental and physical reverses, as in reverse action. A greedy mind is reborn into an impoverished external reality despite intending on having more. A generous, kind, loving mind is reborn into abundant external conditions despite intending on giving up. If a greedy mind is inclined to having more, why wouldn't it be reborn into abundance? And a content person into humble conditions? You need some irrational faith in the karma reversal currency of merit. Well, I do think there are some kind of misconceptions here. First of all, there really is no past karma or present or future karma. There's only present karma, because according to Orthodox Theravada, only the present moment exists. The past no longer exists. The future doesn't exist yet. Therefore, they are unreal. All karma is present karma. And it's not necessarily the case that something that you do in this life is necessarily going to have effects in a future life. I mean, it can have instantaneous effects. You know, you get mad, you kick something and you hurt your foot. That's like an instantaneous effect of your karma, of just being pissed off and kicking something. So let's see here. Also, it seems he's referring to a kind of reverse action where a greedy mind is reborn into an impoverished external reality, but that's not necessarily the case. I mean, karma is like the momentum of your mental energy. And if you're really into acquiring stuff, you know, you're a greedy person, that doesn't mean that you're just going to be punished the next time around by being poor. I mean, it could be that you're just building up this momentum. And I mean, apparently a lot of people do have a lot of karmic momentum in a certain direction. Like Mozart was composing symphonies when he was a little kid, because apparently he had a lot of parami, or just accumulated momentum in a musical direction before he was even born. And so it may be that a greedy mind can be reborn into like wealth, for example, but then the suffering comes from the wealth. It's like a lot of rich parents, they've got kids that are just, Hunter Biden types or junkies or whatever. And it's like their own desire for all this stuff just kind of backfires on them. Or if you're lucky, then you're born into wealth and you get everything you want and you have the wisdom to realize that you're still not satisfied. So, also here, a generous, kind, loving mind is reborn into abundant external conditions. Not necessarily, though. I mean, um, it depends on the individual. It's like what you need is going to happen. So, I mean, like St. John of the Cross, possibly my favorite Christian. I mean, he was a saintly person, very wise person, but his childhood just sucked. And it was like when he was full grown, he was only like 4'10" due to malnutrition as a child, in all likelihood. He had a brother who died in childhood. They think possibly due to malnutrition or just flat out starvation. I mean, his father died when he was little, and the greater family just disowned the entire family. Spaniards in those days could be relatively harsh and cruel, I guess. And so he got sent to a school for poor boys where he could get a free education, but it wasn't 100% free because he had to work to earn his education. And even as a little kid, he was working in a plague hospital. So he's carrying like buckets of puke and diarrhea and stuff from people dying of plague when he's a little kid. And he just got slammed into sainthood, it seems like. It was like some people are born saintly, others attain saintliness, and some have saintliness thrust upon them. And I think St. John of the Cross just had saintliness thrust upon him, but it was due to his karma, and it was like what he needed, I guess. So good people can have a lot of harrowing ordeals just because that's what they need for their karmic, like, I don't want to say retribution, but it's just for, everything to like seek equilibrium. Karma is always heading towards equilibrium. But then we keep making new karma. It's like Paul Lowe says, the system is self-healing, except that it's all the time we're adding this new karma that maintains the disequilibrium. So, yeah, it's not necessarily the case that if you're greedy, you're going to be born poor, and if you're generous, you're going to be born rich. I mean, it can just be the exact opposite. It depends on your unique combination of karmic factors. And it's too complicated to predict, really. So I think I'll just move on to Cool Whip's next question, which is entitled Society and Silence. How does one live in a social reality when their minds become empty of words as silent beings? Well, I've read in the biography of Sri Aurobindo that he was in a state of non-thinking even when he was writing books and talking to people. And I do think that is possible, where you don't have to think about what you're going to do. It just spontaneously flows out of you. Like if you're dancing, you're really good at dancing. You don't have to be thinking about what your next step's going to be. It just flows. And it can be that way with talking and so forth, even without the internal dialogue formulating what you're going to say. It just comes out. But let's just assume that that's bullshit. And this, like, assuming that that is not the case, when your mind becomes empty of words as silent beings, I mean, yeah, I guess you'd renounce the world, or in I think it's the Zhuangzi says that if you're born into a human body, you just are obligated to behave like a human just because you're surrounded by humans and that's the way you get along in this life. On the other hand, I'm getting back to the silent beings. Ramana Maharshi, when he had his attainment as a teenager, it took him years before he was finally able to integrate this voidness with the samsaric empirical world. So he was like mute for a few years before he was finally able to gradually integrate the two visions, so to speak. But how does one live in a social reality? I assume it just happens spontaneously if you're advanced enough that you don't need to think anymore. Or, I mean, if you do think, you're mindful of the thinking. Let's say there's a situation where you just have to think in words or symbols, then you do it mindfully and you wouldn't be identified with the words and symbols. You wouldn't be identified with the thinking, that it would just be nature taking its course because that's what your brain naturally does. And you like the center of your consciousness would not be there. You'd be just kind of sitting back, observing it all or something. So I'll just move on to Cool Whip's next question here on Buddhist metaphysics. Do all Buddhist traditions share the same metaphysics of no self, or do each have an interpretation of no self? Are the differences ultimately down to what mind and matter are? If not, then what? Well, I mean, even the Theravadin tradition has more than one explanation of no self. Just because no self is troublesome, it's difficult to understand, it's kind of counterintuitive, hard to wrap your head around sometimes. And so different sub-traditions within Theravada, even within the suttas, have different explanations of no self. For example, the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the Buddha's second discourse according to tradition after his enlightenment. I mean, he's saying that essentially the argument is if you don't have control over it, it's not you. So like with regard to the 5 khandhas that make up a human being, the 5 aggregates, you can't say with regard to any of them, let it be this way, let it not be that way, and have it reliably happen. That's even with regard to Sankhara Khandha, which is essentially volition. I mean, you're not even in complete control of your own volitions. But then there's also like the famous chariot, the simile of the chariot, which is another explanation of no self, that a self is just a term of convenience describing an ever-changing, adjustable assemblage of constituent parts. But then when you get into Abhidhamma, one of the arguments is that anything that can be divided down into smaller parts cannot be considered an individual entity, a Dhamma. And that's one argument that the Mahayana Buddhists, especially the Madhyamaka Buddhists, used against the Abhidharma scholars by saying that, anything, no matter how far down it gets divided, you got like this atomic particle of some blueness or something, just it's like, according to the older schools, it can't be divided down any further. But still, in Mahayana, you say, well, it's still going to have a top half and a bottom half. It's going to have a beginning and an end. So you can divide that at least in your mind. And I mean, dividing something at least in your mind is valid from a Theravadin point of view, because there are some things that cannot arise separately, even though they're considered to be 2 different things, like volition and perception, for example. They have to arise at the same time always. They cannot be divided in reality, but still they're considered to be 2 different things. And so you can say, well, the top half and the bottom half are also different, because I mean, they got, obviously top half is not the same as bottom half. So I think in the older traditions, they were referring to a subjective self, like a soul, an individual personality that is really an individual. Whereas when you get into Mahayana Buddhism, it becomes a broader, or even objective selves, any kind of objective object at all lacks an intrinsic self-essence. So let's see here. See if I'm answering this question, if I've digressed again. Do all Buddhist traditions share the same metaphysics of no self? No, like I was saying, the Mahayana Buddhists are more metaphysical, and they're just applying no self even to like the basic particles, constituents of samsaric reality that, for example, Abhidhamma says is real. So are the differences ultimately down to what mind and matter are, or if not, then what? It's not so much mind and matter, it's just a matter of individual self-essence, which Buddhism denies. There is no individual self-essence, except according to Abhidhamma in these like atomic constituents of samsaric reality, but Mahayana even denies the existence of those. So I guess I answered that question. It's not an easy question to discuss, I guess. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, do you believe that people's psychic energy can manifest in your body as headaches or other bodily sensations? And I would say, sure. I mean, if you're in a room with somebody who's just like losing their cool, they're just losing their shit, they're freaking out, then that's going to have an effect on everyone around them. They might not even be directing it at you. They might be freaking out at somebody else, but still, there's going to be this, it's just going to be permeating the atmosphere and it's going to have an effect on you. I'm reminded of Ram Dass in one of his books saying that he had a teacher in India who, if he ate food that was cooked by someone who was angry, he would become violently ill just because of like the vibes in the food. So he is very sensitive to like the bad moods of other people, for example. But yeah, mental states are contagious, which is one of the main reasons why in the Mangala Sutta, the list of the 38 great blessings in life, blessing number 1 is not associating with fools, because mental states are contagious and their toxic mental states are going to affect you. So yeah, I do believe that people's psychic energy can manifest in your body as headaches or other bodily sensations. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Crave Minerals. And I sincerely hope this is really recording this time. I'm just putting it out there. This is from Crave Minerals. And Crave Minerals says, if someone close to you is going through a sort of meaning crisis, for example, a Christian struggling with faith and approaching the end of life, being overcome with doubt and fear, and you wish to somehow alleviate their worries, however slightly, what would a good Buddhist do? I recognize that this loss of faith is not really something that can be helped and is, after all, a personal matter and a healthy thing to question in the long run, but I just wish they could somehow feel better. And yeah, with regard to a person struggling with their own faith, I mean, that's entirely internal to them, it seems. And I mean, the best you can do is just be compassionate, be honest. I mean, sometimes, I mean, I don't know, each person having a problem like this it's going to be a unique thing. And so I can't just say, well, you should say this, that, and the other thing, because it will depend on the individual. I am reminded that Ram Dass, again, in one of his books, is talking about how his father, when he got old, was kind of having he's struggling with faith in his own self. He's just starting to see himself as a failure who wasted his life doing the wrong things. And Ram Dass, fresh from India, he's just hanging out with his dad and just being grounded in the present moment. And he's talking about how once they were making jam or something, and his father is just sort of like doing these monologues about what a failure his life has been and so forth. And Ram Dass is just saying, oh, well, I mean, should we put this much sugar in it? Or like, how much pectin do we need? And he's just staying like in the present moment. It's not like he's ignoring his father. It's just that he's trying to remain in the present moment as a kind of, I don't know, like an anchor or something, just trying to ground the situation to some degree. And at least it helped his father feel a little more comfortable, because he's just lost in all this speculative stuff. Whereas, I mean, the reality, if we can call it a reality, is just right here and now. But I mean, if they're losing their faith in Christianity, I mean, if you're not a Christian, I mean, you can point out that, I mean, I'm not a Christian. I'm doing fine, apparently. But I mean, if they think that they're going to burn in hell for not being a Christian, then they haven't really lost their faith, have they? So I'm not exactly sure what you would tell somebody in a situation like this. My own grandmother had a catastrophic loss of faith when she was very old, like in her 90s. But I wasn't there. I mean, I wasn't there to do anything about it. I just heard about it secondhand, long afterwards. But she was just a devout, Bible thumping Southern Baptist Christian who then later in life converted over to Seventh day Adventism. And, Jesus is coming. And she was just really into it. And then finally, she started getting mad at God because he would not take her. She just kept getting older and older and older and more feeble, and just wouldn't die. and she wanted to just go to heaven and, be with, her loved ones and so forth. And God just wouldn't take her. And finally, she just got pissed off at him and just kind of lost her faith in that way. But yeah, again, I'm babbling here. Crave minerals, I'm not exactly sure what you would say other than just be compassionate and honest and try to remain grounded and try not, getting lost in this ephemeral theoretical stuff that maybe is what they are lost in. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Crave Minerals also. He says, how do you feel about Buddhists that talk about God? For example, I saw Thich Nhat Hanh talked quite gracefully about God and Nibbana in the same breath. Below is a quote to show you what I mean. Quote, God as the ground of being cannot be conceived of. Nirvana also cannot be conceived of. If we are aware when we use the word nirvana or the word God that we are talking about the ground of being, there is no danger in using these words. And I admit I've done the same thing. Like if you're trying to explain spirituality from a Buddhist point of view to a Christian, you don't use Pali terms. They won't, you use words that they can understand. And so, you talk about the spirit of God that pervades all things. And like Buddhists, in a sense, is you're trying to not be distracted by all this worldly stuff so that you just see through to the spirit of God that pervades all things. And it's kind of skillful means. It's at least you're using a way of communicating that they can sort of get an idea of what you're talking about. So, and then when you get into like Vedanta, what they're talking about is God, and what Buddhists talk about as Nibbana, the difference is mainly verbal. It's just semantic, really. I'm pretty sure that the sages who experienced Brahman and the sages who experienced Nirvana they're just trying to use different paradigms, different cultural explanations for describing the same thing. And so the Hindus are more into describing it, as something divine and like God, because that's the Vedic tradition is pretty much theocentric. So yeah, I don't really see any danger in that so long as you're not using God as, the angry old man that lives in the sky and, he's got a chosen people and he gets pissed off a lot and smites people a lot and got the angels fluttering around his feet like butterflies and so forth. Yeah, so long as you're not thinking of God as a kind of cosmic Santa Claus, except wearing a white suit instead of a red one and not nearly so jolly, then so long as you're using God pretty much in a Vedantic sense of just reality, or even a lot of theology, like Catholic theology, really their God is just an abstraction. So yeah, so long as you keep in mind what you're doing, then I think you're doing okay. If you just define God as a reality and you define nirvana as reality, then so long as you make it clear that's what you're doing, then I don't think it's particularly dangerous. Although a lot of hard-nosed dogmatists may seriously take issue with it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Tiggles, formerly known as Hey It's Tig. And Tiggles says, any plans on having Ajahn Punnadhammo back on your show? And he's referring to about a year ago, Brian Rue, Ajahn Punnadhammo, and I were doing shows every 3 weeks. We do like 1 or 2 videos discussing various topics. And then Ajahn Punnadhammo, some of Ajahn Punnadhammo's supporters began a kind of protest against Ajahn Punnadhammo associating with a known Nazi. Mainly Brian Rue. I don't know to what extent, if any, I was involved in their protests. It was mainly they were protesting against Ajahn Punnadhammo associating with Brian Rue. And Brian Rue is a sincere Buddhist. He's a good guy. He's got some strange ideas, but even so, he's harmless. And anyway, that ended the videos we were doing. And then last spring, I emailed Ajahn Punnadhammo and asked him if maybe he and I could do some videos together. And he was saying, and he was explaining, why he had to stop doing the videos with Brian and me. But he said maybe in the summer, and then I never followed up. He never followed up, and it just didn't happen. So yeah, it's possible, but it's kind of a shame that Brian can't be involved in it because Ajahn Punnadhammo said he didn't want to die on that hill. He has to choose his battles, and just losing a lot of his supporters or some of his supporters because he refuses to stop doing videos with Brian Rue was just a little much for him. So it's possible. I don't know. So next question is from NWO Games Alert. And I don't think NWO Games Alert has asked questions before, or if he has, or they have, or she has, they went by a different name. And so in their innocence, they asked, I think, 7 questions here. And just this once, because they're a newcomer, maybe innocent of the new rules, and the newer new rule is 3 questions each. 3 shall be the number of the count. No more. Well, there can be less. So anyways, New World Order Games Alert. I mean, the first questions are all kind of related, and they can be answered relatively quickly. So I'll just humor I almost said New World Order, NWO Games Alert. And the first question here is, are animals subject to karma and reincarnation? If yes, then explain how an animal can sin, gain merits, or indulge in morally good or bad behavior. If no, then explain where in our evolution from animal to human did humans begin to be subjected to rebirth in karma? Were Australopithecus, Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, Homo erectus, etc. subject to reincarnation in the law of karma, or is it only Homo sapiens who is subject to universal or divine moral laws? So that's like 3 or 4 questions right there, telescoped into one. So the first part here is, are animals subject to karma and reincarnation? Yes. Any animal that has mentality evolved enough that it can have perceptions and volitions is going to make karma. Karma is volition. And so from the Buddhist point of view, even like plankton, like copepods in the ocean, are going to be subject to karma and reincarnation. Personally, I'm not sure that a copepod really has volition and perception. It may be that some of the more advanced invertebrates, like an octopus, does, and also in like the phylum Chordata, to which we belong. It go back at least as far as fish, like whether an acorn worm makes karma or not. I don't know, because I don't really know what kind of a mind an acorn worm has. So if yes, then explain how an animal can sin, gain merits, or indulge in morally good or bad behavior. Well, sin is really not a Buddhist term. That's more of a Christian term. Morally bad behavior they can do a lot of, which is why animals, from the Theravada Buddhist point of view, are pretty much stuck in the animal realm for a long time. In fact, there's a sutta discussing how hard it is to get out of the animal realm once you're in there. And you've got a yoke which goes around like the neck of an ox. It's shaped sort of like a toilet seat, I think. So let's just say toilet seat in order to convert it into something that you can easily understand. So you got this toilet seat floating around on the ocean, the vast ocean, and there's this sea turtle who comes up for air once every 100 years to take a breath. And so the odds of getting out of the animal realm once you're in it are about equivalent to the odds of that sea turtle, just through random chance, coming up and poking his head up through the middle of the toilet seat as it floats on the surface of the ocean when it comes up to take a breath. Because according to Theravada, animals really can't earn merit, or it's very rare and difficult for an animal to earn merit, but they earn demerit a lot just through like delusion. They got a lot of greed, hate, and delusion. And that's bad karma. But I do think that animals are more capable of getting good karma than orthodox Theravada claims. There are stories of dolphins who are helping drowning swimmers, dolphins trying to help harpoon whales. They get on either side of the whale and help pushing it up so it can breathe. And I mean, even like a mother chicken loving her chicks, you can say it's just blind instinct, but in human beings also, there's a lot of blind instinct involved in the maternal instinct. And just parental instincts. I mean, it's animal instincts, and that doesn't make the love any less genuine, even if it's conditioned by animal instincts and hormones and so forth. And animals love their babies, at least the ones that take care of their babies. And, they can be, you know, animals can show good qualities. I mean, especially if you have a dog, and I mean, it'd be a really insensitive, shallow person who would think that a dog is just some kind of automaton with no mind. If you look into a dog's eyes, there isn't somebody looking back at you. So, yeah, so it is possible for an animal to gain merits. Like for example, even in the Theravada Pali texts, or it's in the commentaries, I think there's the story of a frog who went to heaven, and the Buddha was giving a discourse, and there's a frog that's just sitting there, and it can't understand the Buddha's words, but it's like the melodious, like gentleness of the Buddha's voice had this frog in a kind of for a frog anyway, an exalted mental state, and it's just listening to the sound of the Buddha's voice and enjoying it as something beautiful. And then this shepherd with a stick, like shepherds used to have, he just comes in without even knowing it, without seeing the frog at all. He just puts a stick down on the frog's head and squishes the frog's head and kills it. But because the frog was in this exalted mental state, when it died, it went up into heaven. I think it went into Tawatimsa heaven and became the frog god, not Kek, which is a different frog god. So, I guess I've answered all these questions, because certainly Australopithecines and monkeys and tree shrews and reptiles and so forth are making karma, that they do, they're subject to the same laws as any other sentient being. So I'll just move on to NWO Games Alert's next question here. How soon after death is a human reborn into continuous existence in samsara? Is there a fixed waiting time, a bardo existence, or a heaven where they are stored together with their karma? It has to be instantaneous. Going with Theravada Buddhism, once your life stops in this life, once you're brain dead, so to speak, then the very next moment, like a trillionth of a second later, you have to take a rebirth somewhere else. And I mean, it's kind of a misconception here where he's talking about a heaven where beings are stored together with their karma, because there are no beings to be stored. It's just the karma. That's all that is that's all that transmigrates from one life to the next, is just the momentum, the psychic momentum of karma, which causes the next rebirth. And there cannot be a break in it. It's got to be continuous. It's this stream, sort of like Schopenhauer's will. There could be a kind of bardo existence, in that, I mean, the bardo existence could just be sort of an ephemeral, temporary next life in between this life and like the next long, like a human life or something. Let's say it's your karma to be reborn, as a royal prince or something. There may be like a wait for that, or who knows. So, I mean, it can be that you go through a kind of bardo existence, like is described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But that would just be its own existence. I mean, it wouldn't be in between existences. That would be its own existence. So I'll just move on to NWO Games Alert's next question here. Is samsara on planet Earth, or are there other realms, planets, or planes of existence where samsara can unfold and karma can take its course? And in parentheses, he's got, this question really is for Brian Rue. And this is an easy question. Brian Rue gets all the easy questions, I think. Samsara is just universal. It's just this cosmos is samsara. and there are like an infinite number of worlds. So if one world is destroyed, then the beings from that world will go to a very similar world that isn't necessarily light years away in space. It can just be half an inch sideways through probability. Although early Buddhism doesn't really have a concept of other dimensions, like the fifth dimension of probability or something. But there are an infinite number of worlds. So let's see here. Next question from NWO Games Alert. Pretty sure. Yeah. Next question. The course of human existence begins with a few millions, rapidly expanding to billions, trillions, and then endless myriads of individuals through tens of thousands of generations. If reincarnation is a thing, how is it possible to find space and time on Earth for these ever-increasing numbers to continue wandering in samsara in order to fulfill their destiny and reach liberation? Well, there's at least two different ways of explaining this. One is what I just said, the many worlds hypothesis, that there are an infinite number of worlds, and one world is destroyed. It's like some of those beings will just be reborn in this world as almost like refugees or something. But also, it could be that most humans just haven't been human for very long, that we came from some other realm, like came up from the animal realm or from some spirit realm or something. And that may help to explain why there seem to be so many NPCs walking around, just complete normies with hardly an original thought in their head. It does remind me of a story by J.D. Salinger called Teddy, about this kid born into a dysfunctional family in New York City who just happens to be enlightened. And his sister is just horrible. His kid sister is just this little monster. And he's kind of speaking up for her on her behalf, saying that she just hasn't been a human for very many lives. She's still at a crude state of humanity. And I mean, that's another explanation, another possible explanation. Could be a combination of the two. So we'll just move on to NWO Games Alert's last question here. Isn't Buddhism, just like Christianity, in reality just a collection of fairy tales, when all comes to all, a bunch of crap, useful for certain purposes, such as, in the best case, societal harmony, or worse, just another scam, useful for rulers and despots in order to keep people from engaging in violent revolts against their overlords? And this is just a standard argument used by atheists against religion. Supposedly the enlightened atheist can see that all spirituality is just bullshit. And they just grossly misunderstand what spirituality is all about. They just don't get it. I'm not necessarily saying that NWO Games Alert belongs to this category, but apparently he hasn't read many Pali texts, because there's not a whole lot of fairy tales in there. I mean, there are fairy tales in the Pali texts, which I have from the beginning just ignored, because they're really not the essence of the thing. That's not what Buddhism is about. Buddhism is not based on fairy tales. It's not even based really on a narrative. So some religions, I suppose, have been formulated for the purpose of controlling the masses. Like, you've got a warlord who declares himself to be the mouthpiece of God, and that's happened at least twice among the major religions that I can think of. And like cult leaders, it's happened even more times, smaller scale. Yeah, I mean, it's a way of controlling your followers by saying, I'm speaking with the voice of God, so you better do what I say. But with Buddhism and even early Christianity, I mean, the original purpose was to renounce society. So I don't see how that is just a scam cooked up for the purpose of keeping the peasants in their place, or even for societal harmony, really. I mean, when you're renouncing society, then, I mean, the best case of societal harmony, I mean, even that seems to be largely irrelevant. because some early religions, especially the more advanced ones, recognize that society is just fucked up. And so if you really want to know reality, you go off alone into a desert or into a forest and just contemplate, just turn inwards, introspect. And yeah, I really don't know how the cynical atheists would account for that. That's how Buddhism began, that's how Christianity began. Maybe not to the same extent as Buddhism, where it's just saying renounce the world, just go alone like the horn of the rhinoceros, meditate under a tree in a wilderness. Don't have anything to do with lay people in villages. I mean, how is that just some sort of scam cooked up by a government? So, yeah, I'd say no. The quick answer to that question, isn't Buddhism just like Christianity in reality just a collection of fairy tales when all comes to all a bunch of crap? Yeah, that'd be no. And I wouldn't even say that was true of Christianity. I mean, there is a lot of goodness in Christianity, but cynics will just point to the bad stuff and say, there you go, it's crap. But I mean, it's not so much Christianity that is crap as just human nature that's got a lot of crap in it. That when human beings, even if they inherit an enlightened spiritual tradition, they're likely to just turn into crap, especially when it becomes mainstream. And then you've got like ambitious, like politician types getting in so that they can control it. It's like early Christianity. Once it went mainstream, you've got just really corrupt politician types that are becoming bishops and like patriarchs and so forth, just because that's their way to power. And that happened, and it wasn't really the fault of Jesus or the fault of the Buddha. When this sort of thing happens, it's just corrupt human nature. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here, and this is from Oyalt. And Oyalt says, my first question was about Bo Aung and if he had any spiritual significance to you. And in the previous Q&A, I pointed out Bo Aung, who's on my altar behind me when I'm in the other room, but I'm not in that room. But it would be right there. And Bo Aung, he doesn't have any spiritual significance to me. I used to see little Bo Aung images on altars all through Burma. Bo Aung he's like second or third place for personages that go onto Buddhist altars. I mean, the Buddha is number one, of course. And, there's some other ones like Shin Upagot. But Bo Aung, he was an alchemist or a Weza. And he was very powerful and he was very much revered, and he still is to this day, apparently, due his commonness on Buddhist altars. Because in order to be a Weza or like an alchemist or wizard of the top rank, you've got to use like powerful, like the highest spiritual powers. And that's Dhamma. I mean, the most powerful alchemists and wizards are going to be white because they're going to be kind of channeling or tapping into Dhamma, which is the most powerful, has the most spiritual power. Even so, though, I mean, the most famous story about Bo Aung was there was some lady who was starting a business, and she went to Bo Aung for his blessing so that her business could prosper. And he just whipped out his penis and slapped her upside the head with it, and then just resheathed the penis, and that was it. That was the blessing. But apparently it worked because she got rich after that. Her business really prospered. So there must have been something to it, I guess. But let's see. The only reason I've got that Bo Aung little image is that I was at this monastery and it had this box of stuff that they were just giving away free. It was like old Dhamma books and stuff. And there was this little Bo Aung image in there. And I'd seen Bo Aung so many times, and I don't know. I just grabbed it. It was for free distribution. Just put it on my altar. So I think I'll just move on to Oyalt's next question, which is as follows. And these questions are all in the past tense because he asked once before and it somehow got disappeared off YouTube, which happens pretty frequently. So then he says, I asked if during mediation, the most common typo for Buddhists is typing mediation instead of meditation. I asked if during meditation, if you ever experienced your consciousness leave your body and experience a reality that appeared to be more realistic than this current reality. Well, that's like a two-part question. The first part, no, I've never experienced I never had an out-of-body experience during meditation. But the second part is, did I experience a reality that appeared to be more realistic than this current reality? Yeah, which was like a mystical state. It wasn't some other world, with all this different stuff that was more vivid and more lifelike, more realistic, whatever that means. But just the mystical state itself is definitely more realistic than this dreamscape that we're living in with all like doors and windows and shirts. So it was a mystical state that was non-differentiated, that was just crystal clear. Anyway, I guess I'll just move on to oils. Third and last question here. My final question was, is bovine glandular secretion your favorite beverage? And I am drinking it now. But I wouldn't say that I even have a favorite beverage. Like, if I could only drink one thing for the rest of my life, it wouldn't be milk. Because, I don't know, it's like sometimes you're just not in the mood for milk. So, I don't know what it'd be, some kind of fruit juice, maybe? There used to be this stuff I used to drink a lot when I was a young man, before I was a monk, it was Dharma juice. It was the company was called Dharma juice, and it was cold pressed apple cranberry cider, which was really good. So, I mean, they don't make it anymore. They got bought out by some big corporation. But yeah, if I just had through magical means an infinite supply of that, then that might be the only thing I would drink if I was forced to drink only one thing. But then again, I might just go for water or something. So yeah, I do like milk, but yeah, I wouldn't want to. I don't know. I don't think it's my favorite. I mean, it is nice. I'm not going to badmouth milk here. You're not going to see me badmouthing milk on my own videos. Anyway, I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Pranav. And Pranav says, what's your opinion on Venerable Mahamoggallana fighting Nandopananda Naga? Isn't it surprising that a monk fight? Well, the Buddha himself also had a duel with a fire-breathing cobra dragon. And it seems to have been pretty common in the first few years of the Buddha Sasana that you would have some enlightened sage facing off against a fire-breathing cobra dragon. And it wasn't like a fight, like a violent fight like St. George slaying the dragon. It was more a matter of, you've got like an enlightened being, you've got a great sage who has great psychic power, and his psychic power is more powerful than the psychic power of the fire-breathing dragon that allows it to shapeshift and breathe fire and so forth. That it's considered to be a matter of psychic powers that a cobra dragon breathes fire. So it's sort of like the Buddha or Mahamoggallana is like the sun, and this cobra dragon's like a candle in broad daylight, and the sunlight just overwhelms the candle flame so you can hardly even see it on a bright day. So, and then that's kind of symbolized by, at the end of the duel, the sage, either the Buddha or Mahamoggallana or somebody else, comes back to the populace with this cobra dragon just reduced to this little wimpy snake about this big that they're carrying in their alms bowl. And personally, I'm kind of skeptical that there are shape-shifting, fire-breathing cobra dragons with human intelligence. That my theory is that the belief in Nagas and the belief in dragons in general is evolved from prehistoric cobra worship in maybe northwestern India, like the Indus Valley civilization. Because, I mean, a cobra is an impressive creature. A king cobra can get 18 feet long. And when it stands up on its hind legs, so to speak, It can be 6 feet high with a hood like this wide, and it makes these weird cat, 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 cat kind of sounds. And if it bites you, you die. So it's easy to see why people would start revering them as like magical beings and start making offerings to them so that they won't like get bitten. So yeah, it wasn't really a violent fight. It was just the power, the psychic power of the sage. It just drowns out the psychic power of the snake. And there are precedents like this in the Pali text. Like for example, the origin of the Metta Sutta comes from, you had a group of monks who were very advanced. They move into this forest to meditate for the rains retreat. And because of their great psychic power, the tree-dwelling devas, the deities in this forest, the nature deities, they couldn't exercise their own psychic powers. Like the tree deities couldn't even levitate up into their trees because their own power was just so drowned out and overwhelmed by the psychic power of these monks. So, I mean, that's kind of the mechanics of how it works. And personally, I think these stories of Buddhist sages overwhelming fire-breathing dragons was a kind of religious propaganda. Probably there was a lot of cobra worship or Naga worship in the Buddhist time. There was even Naga worship in early Burma, like medieval Burma. And, it's just like the propagandists are coming up with these stories and saying, look, our sages are more powerful than your dragon, so you might as well just become a Buddhist. But who knows, maybe fire-breathing cobra dragons will be discovered in the valley of the Himalayas any day now. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Indian Guy, also known to some as Trevor. An Indian Guy says, what do you know now that makes you say that you wouldn't become a monk over again? Well, it's just like, if I knew then what I know now, it wouldn't be necessary to follow the same path that I followed last time. Sort of like, if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have to go to junior high because I'd already learned that stuff. I'm not saying that being a monk is like going to junior high school, but I mean, if I could find like an enlightened teacher who could just see right through me, see right where I need help, and then help me do that, that's fine. But I did learn my limitations. I got as far as I could with it, on my own, going alone like the horn of the rhinoceros. And so it was time to try something else after 30 years of, being the solitary monk and strictly practicing, meditating a lot. And yeah, it was just, I got as much as I could get out of it. So I wouldn't want to, retrace the same route anyway. But I've had sort of bad karma when it comes to teachers. It's and partly just it's like my own attitude that having a teacher is like cheating. It's just this feeling I get. It's it's having a teacher. It's just sort of like they're doing the work for you or something. But if I didn't know then what I know now, then of course I'd do it all over again because it was not a mistake, definitely. But if you've already learned what you learned from it, you don't need to do it again. I mean, that was the main point. So I'll just move on to Indian Guy's next question here. Who are your favorite translators of the Buddhist texts? I particularly love the Dhammapada and have found there are many translations. My favorite translators of the Buddhist texts, well, I mean, I have to admit that despite his wacky, to some extent non-Buddhist leftist politics, Bhikkhu Bodhi is about the most solid translator of Pali into English that's translating today. But I mean, he's not really a meditator. He's a scholar. And so he knows Orthodox Buddhist philosophy really well. But when the Orthodox position is not correct, Bhikkhu Bodhi is probably just going to defer to tradition, unlike somebody like Ajahn Punnadhammo, who I don't consider to be quite as good of a translator, but he understands the spirit of Dhamma better than Bhikkhu Bodhi does because he's got some accomplishment in meditation, whereas Bhikkhu Bodhi apparently does not. And with regard to lay translators who aren't serious meditators, they haven't lived the life, there's a lot of stuff they're not going to understand. With regard to the Dhammapada, my favorite translation is, by random chance, I just happen to have it right here. This is the Buddhist Publication Society edition of the Dhammapada, or at least it was like 35 years ago. And it's by Acharya Buddharakkhita, translated by Acharya Buddharakkhita, with an intro by Bhikkhu Bodhi. And this is a good translation. I mean, he pretty much defers to Orthodox tradition, but he's got some interesting endnotes that are interesting, as interesting endnotes tend to be. So I guess I answered that question. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Nature Cure. And Nature Cure says, you talked about no deity a lot, or no view. Then what would the Eightfold Path like Samaditi, what would be Eightfold Paths like Samaditi and the rest? Okay, well, in the Noble Eightfold Path, the first step is right view. I mean, that's like step number one on the Eightfold Path is right view. And that's not the same as no view, which is at the end. I mean, no view is like very advanced. That's like the highest level. Whereas right view is essentially believing, Buddhism is the way to go, or the noble, like the Four Noble Truths, the law of karma, that sort of thing. It's sort of like a roadmap for starting you out on your journey. And I mean, if you start the journey with no map, you're probably gonna go the wrong direction sooner or later. So it's just a difference in advancement. You start off with right view, which really ultimately isn't like ultimate right view, because all view ultimately is just view. It's just like a symbolic perception that isn't reality. A symbol is something that's supposed to stand for reality, but isn't reality. Like TREE on a piece of paper is very different from an actual tree. And it's the same way with the symbols in your mind. They're very different from what they're trying to represent. But eventually you're going to have to just leave all that behind, just transcend, go beyond all these symbolic interpretations of what you think is reality. But that's very advanced. That's, for very advanced practitioners, whereas step number one on the Noble Eightfold Path is just, getting the basics. Just a crude understanding of the basics is good enough to get you going in the right direction. And right view is going to evolve as you evolve spiritually until finally you just leave it behind. It's like the raft that you leave behind after you cross the flood. So I'll just move on to Nature Cure's next question, which is, in Digha Nikaya number 2, the Samanyapala Sutta, monks can touch and hit the sun and moon. What's your opinion on that? Well, yeah, I when I read that as a junior monk, I went to my teachers and say, well, what's the deal with this? How are you going to touch and stroke the sun and moon? And they explained to me that according to the commentaries, all you're doing is you're creating a kind of mind-created replica of the sun or moon and touching that. But it could be that it's just, it was on some standard weird list of psychic powers that was circulating around ancient India, and it just wound up on the list with the more normal psychic powers, just like reading minds and remembering your past lives and levitating and walking on water and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think it could have just wound up on this list through some sort of, obscure cultural reason. But yeah, it's problematic for us Westerners that somebody's going to reach out using psychic powers and stroke the sun. I mean, it would be really hot, you would think. I mean, maybe if you did it at night, then it'd be okay. But I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. And that is it possible to become an arahant these days, in your opinion? Well, I mean, again, arahants are problematic. I mean, it's difficult to say whether they even exist in a samsaric context. For example, um, if Nibbana is completely off the scale, then what do you say of someone who has attained Nibbana? It's like, it really doesn't, I mean, it doesn't register in this world. But let's just assume for the sake of argument that there are arahants, then I don't see any reason why there wouldn't be arahants in this world today. Like Ram Dass used to say, I keep bringing up Ram Dass, and in fact, I keep bringing up this same thing that Ram Dass used to say is like, you can travel halfway around the world and go to the Himalayas and find some guru who will teach you the secrets of the universe, while the whole time your Aunt Mabel in Massachusetts was enlightened the whole time. Except instead of telling you the secrets of the universe, she says, have some soup. But it just turns out that have some soup is the perfect thing to say under those circumstances. So, assuming that it is possible for anyone at any time to become an arahant, in ancient times, modern times, whatever, then I don't think that there's any reason why one couldn't become an arahant these days, even though the culture is less spiritual than it was, say, in the Iron Age Ganges Valley. But some people are just ripe. It's like you can't stop the ripeness of their parami. They're ready. And so I still think it can happen. And they don't even necessarily have to be Theravada Buddhists, in my opinion, which is rank heresy, I'm sure, to Theravada Buddhist dogmatists. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Quick Quiz. And I sincerely hope it's recording this time. It says it's recording, but I think it said it was recording last time too. It's not even funny. So, Quick Quiz says, if a Theravada layperson had a glimpse of Nibbana, let's consider for sure, and he has no savings or interest to work for money, and he doesn't believe in monasteries, how should he continue to live this life? Well, I mean, he does have the option of becoming like Peace Pilgrim, who was this little old lady who just took off walking on the road with no money and just threw herself at the mercy of the universe. And I mean, that's what really spiritual people are supposed to do. That's what the early Christians were supposed to do. That's what the early Buddhists were supposed to do. Just give no thought for tomorrow, what you will eat or where you will sleep. Just take off walking. Man, that's one thing you could do. I mean, if you have no savings or interest to work for money, I mean, still, I mean, if you don't want to just take off walking like Peace Pilgrim or an early Buddhist or Christian sage, then maybe you could overcome your lack of interest to work for money and just get some simple job that's enough to hold your mind and body together. Or, I mean, if you don't believe in monasteries, but still wouldn't be totally opposed to living in one, you become a monastery attendant, which is be a fairly good spiritual way of living without having to follow all the rules. And then you just be driving monks around and cooking their meals for them and mowing the lawn and stuff. And it'd be like a peaceful environment. That wouldn't be too bad. So I'll just move on to Quick Quiz's next question here. If he joins the monastery but doesn't really follow all the rules and meditation methods or acting like he is accepting everything, is he causing himself hardship? Well, I mean, if you become a monk and you don't follow the rules, yeah, you're causing yourself hardship because you're essentially being a dishonest monk. Even if the other monks aren't following the rules either, still, that's no excuse for being a lax monk just because other monks are lax. But again, I mean, you could ordain as a novice, like a koyenji, as they're called in Burma, like a big novice, in which you only have to keep 10 precepts, plus the Sekya rules. Or again, you could just be a monastery attendant and you pretty much wouldn't have to follow any rules other than maybe 5 or 8 precepts. Still have to handle money because you'd be handling the money for the monks. But partly, I think it would depend on how open-minded the Sangha is at the monastery, at which you weren't following the rules or acting like you were believing everything that they supposedly are supposed to believe. I mean, some monasteries are open-minded and they know how weird, eclectic lukewarm, head-oriented Westerners are. And then other ones, they might be just very dogmatic and say, no, I mean, if you're not going to believe this stuff, then you should just go away. So it would depend to some degree on how open-minded the Sangha and especially the abbot are at different monasteries. But again, you have the options of becoming a novice, an adult novice, or just being a monastery attendant. Or you can just hit the road. So I'll just move on to Quick Quiz's next question here. Or should he live a lay life and consider going to pariyatti school, write and translate books or something, teach people meditation and sort of scholarly type of lay life, and follow Vinaya as much as possible? Well, if you're not a monk, you don't have to follow Vinaya at all, other than 5 or 8 precepts, which are for lay people. More spiritual probably than translating Dhamma books would be just like working in a soup kitchen, just selfless service to others, something like that. Or, I mean, if you want to be a meditation teacher, that's fine too, but you should have a lot of experience in meditation, preferably more than one kind of it. Because a lot of people, they just meditate a little bit, maybe for a few years, and they just try to set themselves up as teachers. And it's to some degree like the blind leading the blind. In pariyatti schools, especially in Burma, I really can't speak for other countries, but pariyatti schools in Burma they're notorious. They're like snake pits. It's monks there who don't follow Vinaya, don't really follow Dhamma. They just want to get a degree and become a famous teacher. And yeah, I've been at a few of these pariyatti schools in Burma, and they're just awful. I mean, if I had to live one as a monk, I wouldn't have stayed a monk nearly as long. Just out of just disgust and disillusionment at the behavior of the monks that live at these places. Not all of them, mind you. Like, I spent over a year at Mahagandhayon in the city of Amarapura, which is a big school monastery. In fact, it was one of the most reputable school monasteries in Burma. It had a reputation for being very strict, which means that about 5% of the monks were seriously trying to follow Vinaya rules. Maybe even 10%. I doubt that it was much more than 10%. Most of the monks still were very lax, including most of the teachers. But even so, I mean, 10% or even 5%, that's way better than the average school monastery in Burma. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Popcorn Boxing. And Popcorn Boxing says, what did you think about A.K. Warder dying almost simultaneously with his wife? Anything mystical? And I'd never heard that A.K. Warder died almost simultaneously with his wife. I don't know if you'd call it mystical or not, but certainly there'd be some karma involved. Maybe they had very strong karma with regard to each other. And I don't know. I don't know how they died. I don't want to toss out any hypotheses like maybe A.K. Warder was like a goose or a stork or a lovebird who, when their mate dies, they just lose all interest in living and just pine away and die. But I don't know. Jimmy Stewart was apparently like that too after his wife died. But I don't know how they died. I don't know the details. And I'd never really heard about it before. So I would say that it's not mystical, but more karmic. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Rui. And God, I really hope this is recording. I don't want to have to do this a third time. Not that I'm complaining about answering you guys' questions, though, by the way. Anyways, Rui says, hello, Panyo. I just deleted a question casting minor aspersions on Mr. Eckhart Tolle. I suppose casting aspersions is not karmically sound anyway. No, so here is a proper question. It is interesting how many Mahayanas still look down on Theravada, which they consider selfish and perhaps not emphasizing so-called loving kindness enough. However, if that was the case, we would not have any transmission of the Theravada tradition available to us at all. The fact is that bhikkhus have been teaching for thousands of years, even if they do not embrace the for the benefit of all sentient beings notion, which is a rather problematic notion in itself. Any thoughts? Well, I mean, ultimately, there are no sentient beings. There is no self. So no sentient beings. So that's one thing that the Mahayanists, they just chain themselves by the leg to this. I'm going to remain unenlightened until all beings are saved, with their bodhisattva vow, when the only way you can save all beings is to save yourself. That's the only being you really can save, is yourself. And again, it's sort of like the house is on fire. It's an old Buddhist metaphor. We're all in a burning house. And so, I mean, which is better for you to do first aid on burn patients, burn victims, that you're applying first aid to the victims, or you find a way out of the house? And then after you find the way out of the house, if you so choose, you can come back in and lead people out. But you can't lead people out of the burning house until you know the way out yourself. And you're not going to learn the way out just from reading books. You have to find the way out on your own. So again, it's like the Diamond Cutter Sutra and also St. John of the Cross have similar statements, in that let's just go with the St. John of the Cross version, where he says you can have one person who's dedicated his life to selfless service of others. He's feeding the hungry and tending to the sick and helping people with no homes to have a home, have a warm, dry bed to sleep in. They're just doing all this stuff to help others. And then you got this other person who was sitting alone in a cell practicing high contemplation, which from the Buddhist perspective would be at least second jhana. So on the one hand, you got this one person doing all this worldly merit stuff, helping others. And then you've got this one other person who is like just practicing jhana. St. John of the Cross says the person practicing jhana is actually helping the world more. And I assume the reason for that is the person who's doing all the selfless service, I mean, it's superficial stuff. It's at the surface level. Whereas the person who is practicing jhana is actually, he's raising the level of consciousness of the entire world. Something along those lines. So really, by helping yourself, you help others. By helping others, you help yourself. We had to recite that every day at the first monastery that I lived at in Pali. So, yeah, it's in there. Like the Buddha himself taught out of compassion. But yeah, it is emphasized even in Theravada that you should have compassion for all beings. It's just that, ultimately, the all beings don't really exist. And again, the only way you're going to help them out of samsara is to find the way out yourself. There is a sutta in the Sutta Nipata, the Navasutta, or the Sutta of the boat, which is saying, you can't help others cross the flood if you're just being washed downstream yourself. So you got to find the way across so that you're able to cross it yourself, and then you can help others across. But Mahayana, I guess, teaches that also. It's just that they're teaching that you should all strive to become a Buddha. But, that's just an anachronism, because originally there probably was no metaphysical difference or wisdom difference between the founder of the system and his enlightened disciples. Because, at least according to Abhidhamma, wisdom is the same as amoha. Panya equals amoha. So panya is wisdom, amoha is just absence of delusion. So if you've got zero delusion, any arahant has zero delusion, which means any arahant has the same amount of wisdom as any other arahant. How can you have different zero delusions? It's just that the Buddha was more of an intellectual genius, or he had certain talents, in addition to the zero moha. But I think I should just move on to the next question. I don't know if I fully answer that, but I'll just move on to the next question. I guess the question at the end is just any thoughts. So I answered it. Yeah, there's thoughts. So I'll move on to the next question here. This is from Facile Goose. And Facile Goose says, any further updates on the Navakavada concept for non-libprog ideologue captured Buddhism in the West? Well, I think like non-libprog ideologue captured Buddhism in the West, I mean, that would just be traditionalism. I mean, you just go with what the texts say. You don't go along with what the new, like the queer academic Buddhists are saying. Like, there's actually Western so-called Buddhists in academia writing that the second noble truth should be revised because the second noble truth says all suffering is caused by desire. But obviously, to the libprog leftist Buddhists, not all suffering is caused by desire because some is caused by patriarchal oppression. So, I mean, that kind of bullshit. I mean, that's if you're going to be a Navakavada Buddhist, if you're going to be like a good Buddhist, like a sincere, authentic Buddhist, then, I mean, you accept the texts as authoritative, at least with regard to ethics. You know, you might not have much use for the fairy tale stuff, the fire breathing cobra dragons and all that, but the ethics is pretty solid. So let's see. Yeah, there are no further updates. I mean, how are you going to have further updates on traditionalism? Because that's essentially what it is. So I'll just move on to Facile Goose's next question. What texts would Navakavada emphasize? And would you incorporate non-Theravadin ones? Thinking of spicy ones like Hakuin Yasutani and the Italians' doctrine of awakening. Well, the main text that Navakavada would emphasize would be the Pali texts. I mean, you could emphasize a few other things, you know, like Ledi Sayadaw's The Manuals of Buddhism, some of the talks by like Ajahn Chah or Mahasi Sayadaw, that kind of thing. Um, would you incorporate non-Theravadin ones? It depends on the person. Some people are quite content with just sticking with Orthodox Theravada. Somebody like me, it's like my mind isn't narrow enough to just fit into this category. So I would read other stuff also, but I wouldn't confuse the Orthodox Theravadin stuff with, you know, the non-Theravadin stuff. You know, you got to keep clear which is which. But you can use the non-Theravada stuff as a way of triangulating. You know, you can find some other tradition, contemplative Christianity, that on their own they come up with the same ideas with regard to advanced yogic practice, for example, that lends a little more credence to Orthodox Theravada. When you've got other systems around the world where, you know, their most advanced practitioners are having the same insights, then yeah, that can be helpful. That can be useful. And just looking at the same issue of spirituality from different angles can be useful. And with regard to the Italian's Doctrine of Awakening, or Julius Evola's Doctrine of Awakening, it is a good book. I mean, I think he takes somewhat of a excessively fascist approach to Buddhism. I mean, it's for the most part it's right, but when he's comparing like a Buddhist enlightened being, an arahant, with like Nietzschean Superman, I think that's kind of pushing it. So, yeah, the main text that Navakavada would emphasize would be the traditional text because it would just be traditional Buddhism, as traditional as one can manage in the West. So you wouldn't necessarily be fully ordained monks because a fully ordained monk in the West is like a tropical plant that has to live in a kind of special protected hothouse environment with caretakers and so forth. And if you want something to really take root naturally in the West, it would have to be more in accordance with modern culture than with ancient Indian culture. But aside from that, I mean, would still follow the same texts. You might not follow Vinaya rules strictly because you're not going to be fully ordained monks anyway. But you just take whatever you can that is applicable to the West and don't totally ignore or reject what isn't applicable to the West because there's still some validity and truth to it. And for God's sake, or for Nibbana's sake, don't just start changing stuff. I mean, if you don't accept something, you don't believe it, I mean, that's fine, just leave it. Don't try to change what Buddhism teaches. Like Second Noble Truth, for example. I mean, that's just basic. And the very fact that there are so-called Western Buddhists who want to modify the Second Noble Truth just indicates that they just don't understand Dhamma. They really, their main faith is in neo-Marxism, and they add a little Buddhist flavoring. Partly as a way of subverting like traditional spiritual systems. So I'll just move on to Facile Goose's next question here, which is thoughts on martial virtue in Buddhism in context of Rohingya Myanmar Buddhists getting wise to Islamists' shenanigans. Yeah, I don't think that the 969 movement in Burma really is a martial movement. I haven't seen it at all. I mean, there have been some fighting between like Burmese Buddhists and like Muslims, but most of the fighting has just been by lay people. It's just like been brawling more than anything else. So, yeah, I mean, martial Buddhism would be more like, Bushido, like the samurai martial ethic of medieval Japan, and even World War II Japan to some degree. Maybe like the Sri Lankan Buddhists fighting for centuries and centuries against the Tamils in Sri Lanka. There's probably some martial virtue in that, but with regard to Burma and the Rohingyas and so forth, it's more verbal. It's just a little bit of criticizing and protesting is mainly what it amounts to. So, I mean, it's sort of pressuring the government to, reduce or stop immigration from Muslim countries, that sort of thing. Mainly they're just stating in a nationalistic way that they want Burma to be for Buddhists. They want Burma to be a traditionally Buddhist culture, and any system, for example, Islam, that is like threatening or seeming to threaten the pure Buddhism of Burma, they're opposed to that and they don't want it to happen and they speak out against it. But that's about as far as it goes, really, aside from brawling. So I'll just move on to Facile Goose's next and last question here. Any experience with PTSD veterans or tailoring teachings to them? And my experience with teaching people in the West is very limited. In Burma, I was mostly a hermit. Sometimes I wouldn't even come out to meet people. I just stay hiding in my cave. And then when I came to the West, most people, including most Buddhists in the West that I came across, didn't really see me as a spiritual resource. Like some of the teachers would just see me as like a threat to their position or something, as competition. So, I mean, I really didn't get into a lot of, like, I never conducted a meditation retreat in the West. But I have been told that there are Dhamma teachers that specialize in teaching PTSD veterans, or just men that have, like troubled men, that there are teachers who specialize in that sort of thing. It's just they're teaching a kind of strong, fearless, masculine kind of Dhamma, which is a traditional kind of Dhamma. So it's out there, but I'm not the one who specializes in it. But it's out there. And unfortunately, I don't even remember the names. I know a friend who knows one of these guys who specializes in doing retreats for guys that have had, traumatic experiences and so forth. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Aung. And Aung says, do paccekabuddhas exist today? And if you go with like Orthodox Theravada, they couldn't exist today because they exist only at times when there is no Buddhism in the world. Like Buddhism dies out, and then you've got, who knows how many millennia between, the dispensation of one Buddha dying out and then the next Buddha coming along and rediscovering Dhamma and, setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion again. That time in between is when paccekabuddhas exist. And they're like hermit Buddhas. They're fully enlightened. They're omniscient in a way, but they're for some reason they don't or can't teach. They just choose, they opt to just mind their own business and stay out in a cave in a wilderness somewhere. And according to legend, Gautama Buddha himself almost became a paccekabuddha because he figured nobody would understand dependent co-arising, and he was pretty much correct on that one. So I'll just move on to Om's next question. What Christmas movie will you watch, or if this is after Christmas, that you have watched? I can recall watching two pretty good Christmas movies. And then I think there was one or two bad ones that just didn't register. You know, there's any number of just sort of low budget, just not very good Christmas movies out there. And I think I've seen one or two of those without it even like fully registering in consciousness. But the two Christmas movies, just a couple nights ago, I watched How the Grinch Stole Christmas, the 2000 version, not the original animated 1960s version, which was good. I like that movie. And again, I think I mentioned this before that, you know, there's no mention at all of the manger or Jesus or the three wise men or anything. It's just the Grinch who steals Christmas. And of course, we're all secretly on the side of the Grinch, you know, sort of like, you know, we're all secretly on the side of King Kong. And I did watch A Christmas Story about the little kid who all he wants for Christmas is this Daisy Red Ryder BB gun. And that was a good movie. I like that. I'd never seen it before. So, yeah, those are the two good Christmas movies that I saw. Is How the Grinch Stole Christmas and A Christmas Story. Oh, also we watched, and now I remember, we watched one of the versions of A Christmas Carol. You know, there's probably like 50 versions of A Christmas Carol out there at least. And we wound up watching the George C. Scott version where he plays Ebenezer Scrooge. Although I think my favorite version of A Christmas Carol is the Mr. Magoo version. So I'll just move on to the next question here, also from And he says, have you been doing walking meditation at night in the dark in the forest or a cave in Burma? So when he says, have you been doing, I assume he means, did you do walking meditation at night in the dark, in the forest, or in a cave in Burma? If I had a cave that was big enough to do walking meditation at night, I would do walking meditation in the cave, especially if there was a door that could close and keep out rats, bats, humans, and snakes. But the thing is, if you do walking meditation at night in the dark, in the forest, in Burma, it has to be like a full moon night, or you have to have candles or some kind of lanterns or something, because you have to be able to see where you're going, because there's poisonous snakes that come out at night. And you don't want to step on a poisonous snake. You know, you step on a Russell's viper and that's it. You have to stop doing your walking meditation. So, yeah, I did do a lot of walking meditation at night in the dark, in the forest, in Burma, but it had to be enough light where you could see where you're stepping. So I'll just move on to Om's next question, which is, how do they or do they at all celebrate December 25th in Burma? Well, I'm pretty sure that December 25th in Burma isn't even a bank holiday. I mean, Burma is a Buddhist country. Christmas is ostensibly a Christian holiday. And so, I mean, it's on the calendars. It'll say Christmas on the calendars, but I don't think that the shops are closed or the schools are closed or anything. And there are Christians in Burma. I mean, it's a relatively large minority, especially in the cities, like in Rangoon. And so before Christmas, there'll be Christmas carolers who go around and they'll stand outside the gate and they'll sing Merry Christmas to you, oh, Merry Christmas to you, oh, Merry Christmas to you, oh, Merry Christmas to you, oh. Just over and over again. And it's mostly they sing it in English because they get their Christianity from like British missionaries. I almost said mercenaries. So, you know, they learn it in like a missionary Christian school or something, and they learn English and then they sing their Christmas carols in English. But that's about as far as it goes. There's no Christmas trees and big Christmas like decorations in the cities or anything like that. And there were times in Burma where I'd be looking at the calendar trying to figure out what day it was, and I'd think, oh, yesterday was Christmas. What do you know about that? Although I did that with my own birthday a few times in Burma too. But it's just not a big deal in Burma. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Maitreya Buddha. And Maitreya Buddha says, who is more enlightened, Gautama Buddha of the Theravada tradition or Shakyamuni Buddha of the Mahayana Vajrayana tradition? Who would win in a debate? Who is more powerful? Well, with regard to who is more enlightened, I mean, assuming that they're even two different people or two different beings, let's say, Theravada has the Buddha as a man. He was a human being. He might have been 27 feet tall, according to the commentaries, but he was a human being. Whereas the Shakyamuni Buddha of the Mahayana or Vajrayana traditions, they've pretty much turned him into a kind of cosmic deity, at least the Sambhogakaya. You know, you got the three bodies of the Buddha in like Yogacara Buddhism, which is a kind of Mahayana. You've got the Nirmanakaya, which is just the human body. You've got the Sambhogakaya, which is like the personification of Buddhahood, you know, as a being up in some exalted heaven realm. And then you've got the Dharmakaya, which is just the Buddha nature, the Buddha essence, the essence of consciousness, this formless and infinite and pervades the entire universe, sort of like the spirit of God or something. But when you get to the question of Maitreya Buddha here, who is more enlightened, then again, it's like what I was saying earlier with you got zero delusion in the human Gautama Buddha of Theravadins. You've got zero delusion in the cosmic Sambhogakaya of the Mahayanists. And zero delusion is zero delusion. It's the same. So they're both fully enlightened. It's just that the cosmic deity probably has some psychic powers that the human being Gautama Buddha didn't have. You know, maybe he can just, you know, his omniscience is faster or something. So who would win in a debate? I don't think they would debate. I mean, there are texts in which the Buddha warns against debating. It just leads to hard feelings and so forth. So I don't think they would debate. But again, if both of them have zero delusion, they'd be equally matched. So I guess the debate would come out as a tie. And with regard to who is more powerful, I guess it would have to be the cosmic deity who, you know, he can just cause worlds to exist by the power of his mind. You know, sort of the Buddha fields of the Pure Land Buddhists. You know, they can just cause this entire world system to just manifest through the power of their mind, which apparently the historical Gautama Buddha didn't do because he just had to make do with living in India, which existed long before he was born. So I guess I answered that question, so I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Keep the Vinaya. And Keep the Vinaya says, you said in one of your recent Q&A streams that you were more dedicated to the Vinaya and not to meditation, but how can being a professional in Vinaya help you to become enlightened? Well, either I misspoke or this is a misunderstanding of what I said, because when I was a junior monk, I was mainly interested in meditation, but I didn't want to break the rules. You know, nobody forced me to become a monk. I was a conscientious monk. I didn't want to break the rules. I wanted to follow Vinaya strictly. And then it turns out that you've got to study Vinaya intensively because there's so many rules, and some of the rules are very like intricate and like difficult to understand and so forth. But my main interest was meditation when I became a monk, and it remained my main emphasis throughout virtually all of my monkhood, right up to the very end. So it's just that you've got Sila Samadhi Panya. You've got morality, concentration, and wisdom. This is sort of like the threefold path of Buddhism. And as a junior monk especially, my meditation was not so good. My wisdom was not good enough to suit me. But the Sila part, the morality part, I could get that down. I could nail that, at least outwardly, maybe not inwardly. I'd still have like dirty thoughts and so forth, but outwardly I could avoid breaking the rules. So that was maybe what I was talking about, which is what Keep the Vinaya is referring to. So I think I answered that question. I'm just going to move on to the next one. By golly, is it true that the Buddha once made racist remarks, racist in quote marks, about a dark-skinned baby? And I don't recall the Buddha making remarks about a dark-skinned baby, except maybe there was one of the two main kings in the Buddha's time. I can't remember if it was Pasenadi Kosala or Bimbisara, but his favorite wife, I think her name was Malika, was considered ugly. You know, it was kind of a joke that the king's favorite wife is ugly because she was dark-skinned. I mean, she had a really good personality. She was wise and gave him valuable advice and so forth, which is why he loved her so much. That, you know, he considered to be pretty much his equal, or, you know, as close as a woman could be to being equal back in those days in that culture. And then she had a baby, and so the king was visiting the Buddha when the messenger comes and says the baby was born, and he says it's a girl. And then the king was like despondent because, of course, he wanted a boy. And then the Buddha says, well, she could grow up and have a boy, which is, I mean, it was kind of a lame consolation. You know, well, you had a daughter, but at least you can be the grandfather of a boy when she grows up and has a boy. But I don't remember making a racist remark about a dark-skinned baby. If it happened, you know, it's certainly not the Buddha saying dark-skinned babies or dark-skinned people in general are inferior to light-skinned people. It would have been more along the lines of him just acknowledging that the culture at his time favors light-skinned people, the dark-skinned people, light-skinned people. It was a symbol of being upper class, really, because you know it was the indigenous inhabitants were dark skinned, and then you had the lighter skinned Indo-Aryans invade and become the ruling class of northern India. So being light skinned indicated, you know, high social status, and that's why light skin was considered more attractive. And it's still kind of that way in Burma, although in Burma, it's just more, if you've got light skin, it's more attractive because that means you're not out in the fields as a laborer getting burned black. You know, you can stay inside. You've got like a cushy job, which generally means that you're of higher social status. You're working in an office, you're a school teacher or a shopkeeper or something, which is higher status than being a subsistence rice farmer. So, I mean, it would be something along the lines of that, just sort of acknowledging that society favors light-skinned people in ancient India. But I, Buddhism is very non-racist. Like, you know, anybody could join the Sangha, and once they join the Sangha, they leave behind all the ethnic luggage, the baggage, you know, all the caste stuff is just left behind, and they just flow together like the rivers flowing together into one ocean. So there really isn't any racism in the Pali text that I can think of. It could be something in there, but other than just, in a way, acknowledging that that is the way the society was already established and that you have to take that into consideration. So I'll just move on to Keep Divinia's next question, which is, what is the essence of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and who is its author? And I don't know if anybody really knows who the author is of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I'm sure Tibetan tradition has somebody set up as the traditional author, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the real author. You know, like pretty much all Mahayana sutras have the Buddha as their author when really he probably wasn't. So yeah, I don't know who the author of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is, but the purpose of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is to guide you in your first experiences after you die. And a lot of the experiences are similar to the stereotypical experiences of people who have had near-death experiences. First you rise up and you see your body lying down there below, in the water or by the side of the road or on the operating table. And then you go up higher and higher until you see this bright light, and you go up into the bright light and you go through the bright light. And then there are like spirit guides on the other side in like a heaven realm. And then you review your life and so forth. It's just the stereotypical, series of things that happen after you die. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead is very similar to that way. Similar to that, it's got the bright light, and they advise you. It's the Book of the Dead is like recited to people who are on their deathbed. It's getting them ready for death. And it's saying when you get into that bright light, stay in it as long as you can, because it has a purifying effect. But eventually, it's like people, they start feeling like they're going to dissolve, and they panic, and then they get out. And then there's like a less bright light, sort of a softer golden light, that you stay in that. And then you start meeting with these spirit beings and so forth. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead is continually reminding you, you're supposed to remind yourself, these are all just mind made. It's like my mind is creating all this. And so it's preparing them to wisely, in a relatively enlightened way, face what's going to happen after they die. And that's the purpose of it. So I guess I answered that question about as well as I'm able to. I'm no authority on Tibetan Buddhism at all. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is from White Ash Piper. And White Ash Piper says, and I should say, before I say what White Ash Piper says, this was the last question yesterday, although somebody asked another question since then. So this would have been the last question of this Q&A. From White Ash Piper, who says, a silly question, I suppose, but it's burning inside me like an attached hot cosl. And I assume he means a hot coal, but he typoed it, and it's C-O-S-L, like an attached hot cosl. Why do all the statues of the Buddha have him with hair, and yet his Buddhist monks are shaved? And yeah, that's true. I used to bring this up to Burmese Buddhists who really don't question their tradition. They don't think about it. It's like the Buddha was a monk. He would have had a shaved head too. Why does he always have hair? And the only explanation for this that I have come across that comes anywhere near to making sense is that the first people to make Buddha statues were Greeks, because Alexander the Great conquered northwestern India, which is now mostly Pakistan, and he started colonies of Greeks in northwestern India, and those Greeks eventually converted to Buddhism. And so the Greeks liked their statues, and so they started making Buddha statues, which didn't exist before they started doing it. In ancient India, like the earliest Buddhist shrines and so forth, they would just have like an empty seat or a footprint or a Bodhi leaf or something to symbolize that the Buddha was no longer in this world. But the Greeks didn't think that way. And so they started making Buddha statues, and they modeled their Buddhas on the god Apollo. Whether there was any kind of connection between, like, the Buddha was identified as like an avatar of Apollo or something, I don't know. But they modeled the Buddha on the god Apollo. And at that time, in that part of the world, the god Apollo was like stylistically represented with an aristocratic hairdo with a kind of a top knot on the top. And so they made their Buddhas with the aristocratic hairdo and the top knot. And the top knot remained long after people knew what it was supposed to be. Like in like Thailand, sometimes you'll have like a flame on the top of the head. And there was one Buddha statue at a monastery that I was staying at. It looked like an onion, like a big onion on the top of his head. And a lot of, or probably most Buddha statues, they just have like this knob there. But that probably evolved from the top knot of the Apollo-like Greek Buddha images. And it just seems silly, because everybody ought to know that the Buddha didn't have hair, that he shaved his head because he was a monk. But then what do you do with that knob that's supposed to be there? mean, you don't want to have like this weird just lump like built into his skull. So yeah, it's just irrational. It's just human nature. You just blindly follow along with your tradition, no matter how problematic or silly it might be. And I'm not saying that Buddhism is like silly overall, but I mean, there are a lot of spiritual traditions or religious traditions that are more than half silliness. And just look at what has replaced religion for many people in the West, which is politics. And I mean, it's just rampant silliness, or worse than silliness. So we got one last question that got in under the wire after my first aborted attempt at doing this Q&A. And again, I sincerely hope this one is recording. And this is from Austin. And Austin says, Punyo, I've been struggling with anger. It's different from sadness. I can't just tune it out. When anger takes over, I feel fully consumed. And even when I recognize it, snapping out of it seems impossible. Any advice on what I can do? Thanks. Well, the only advice I can really give with regard to anger is from my own experience. I'm not a particularly angry person, but it does happen sometimes. And especially when you're a monk and you're trying to practice very strictly, it's like this pressure cooker. You know, it's like your natural urges are restrained and it just builds up this pressure. And so you can explode more easily in some respects. And there were cases when I would just erupt as a monk. There was this one time when I was staying at this place called Tibetan Doya. And I was living under this tree on a flat rock up above the monastery. And that forest was just getting raped to death by village woodcutters. You know, the big trees they'd cut down for timber, the small trees they'd cut down for firewood, and the saplings and stuff, the cows would eat it. So the whole forest was just getting just devastated. And of course, I was a tree hugging nature lover. You know, I still am to some degree. And I mean, I was just like grumbling, you know. And anyways, there were times when I'd just drive out woodcutters from around my tree. You know, I'd come back from alms round and there's like people chopping trees. So one day I come back from alms round, and before I even make it back to my big flat rock, I hear chopping wood coming right up from where I was staying. So, you know, I start getting angry right then and there, and like start walking up, and there's already like poles from chopped small trees just like blocking my path from this guy who'd been chopping trees. And I get up there and I just start first, you know, I'm just raising my voice because he's some distance away, and I just telling him, don't chop wood here. And he says, I'm chopping dry wood, which wasn't entirely true because there were green sapling poles lying on the ground. So I yelled at him again, don't chop wood here. And again, it's, I'm chopping dry wood. And then like the third or fourth time, I kind of just blew my stack, and I started bellowing at him, just don't chop wood here. And my arm just starts going like this. And at the same time that I'm like bellowing at this guy, there's another part of my mind just that's like, wow, I didn't intend to have my arm waving like this. You know, it's like there's this other part of me that's just observing this in kind of mild interest, thinking, you know, that was just purely automatic, just having my arm like waving my finger at him, you know. And it's, I think it was maybe even the last Q&A where there was another time where it was just blazing hot weather. It's just, you cannot be comfortable at all, ever, except maybe when you're taking a bath. It's just, the sweat doesn't stop, and it's just blazing hot, and it won't rain. In central Burma, it's like semi-desert. It was just miserable. And finally, I mean, you just start to crack sometimes. And at one point, I just threw this conniption. You know, I'm just yelling and cussing and slamming things. Fortunately, I was alone in my cave, so I wasn't making a fool of myself in front of others. But, you know, I'm just yelling and just throwing this conniption. And it was like this dissociation happened where one part of me is just throwing the conniption and the other part of me is just watching, you know, just observing. And I mean, that happens. I mean, it can happen to just about anybody. Like my father, was a hardcore alcoholic for many years. And being a macho tough guy, he just decided to just cold turkey and quit drinking. And so he's all by himself in the house, and he's got two escape routes on the table in front of him. He's got a bottle of booze and a loaded pistol just in case it gets too bad. And he's just going through the DTs. He's just raging and tearing at his hair and just, I mean, pissing his pants, just going nuts. And then he starts hallucinating this big eye on the wall, just staring at him. And he knew deep down that was like him observing himself. And it was sort of like a somewhat cruder version of my experience throwing the conniption in the cave, where you get there's like two levels of you. There's the level that's just throwing the conniption, just losing your shit, and then there's this other part it's always there. I mean, when you have an experience like this, it's always there. There's always this observer that's just silently observing everything and not getting involved. And so by being mindful, just practicing mindfulness as much as you can, you're increasing the likelihood of this detachment occurring when you need it to occur, because you can't just wait until you're pissed off and then try to do something about it, because you're already kind of off the tracks at that point. But if you practice mindfulness and just observing your mental states, observing your emotions from a kind of detached perspective, when you're observing something, you've already created a kind of detachment, because if you're anything at all, you're the one who's observing and not the thing being observed. So if you observe anger, for example, already you've got this distance between yourself and the anger. The anger isn't you anymore. You're just watching anger. Anger is arising. But again, you can't wait until you're angry to try to practice this. You have to get into the habit of just mindfully observing your emotions, your mental states, when you're calm, so that when the shit does hit the fan, you've got this habit base that you can rely on, that it'll just kick in. And in some ways, for me, like, I'm not normally a very angry person. In some ways, it's easier to be mindful of anger, because all of a sudden it's like sirens and flashing red lights going on, which is very noticeable. So in a way, it just kind of makes it this unusual thing that you want to just observe. But I don't know how angry of a person Austin is. If you get angry a lot, it might just be a habitual thing that, you're used to it. And so it's not so unusual that it instantly like grabs your attention. But the best advice I can give is just get into the habit of observing your mental states and your emotions mindfully, with this kind of philosophical or spiritual detachment, so that when something really bad happens, or something really volatile happens, then just the habits that you've been developing will make it easier for you to step back and observe it. I mean, you won't necessarily stop being angry. It's like when I was throwing the conniption, I just threw the conniption. It was just this other aspect of my mind. This deeper aspect was just observing and not getting involved. And that weakens it, because so long as you're not identifying with it, you're not, making more momentum. You're not strengthening the habit. It's just the habit is running itself out without being reinforced. But that's about the best thing I can do, or just avoid situations that cause anger. Although, I mean, that's a makeshift, and you can't completely avoid situations. Like, you got to drive in traffic and there's people driving like idiots, then you're pretty much just, you have to deal with that. But I guess I answered that question, and now I'm done answering questions. I hope until next week. I really hope that this recorded this time. And smash the like button. You know the drill. Smash the like button and subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the URL links below, which includes the links to Amazon and the books that I have for sale that I wrote. And be happy.